We have the professor who thinks liberal and conservative brains are different coming up on the Dennis Prager Show. Hello, everybody. You're listening to the Dennis Prager Show. I have a professor of political science at Rice University on. He is one of three authors of a book, and it is titled Predisposed, and the subtitle is Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. It's a risky theme, so we'll find out what the three professors have, but we're speaking to one of the three, John Alford. Professor Alford, welcome to the Dennis Prager Show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
I appreciate that. Isn't that a risky thing that you undertook to argue that there are biological bases for political positions?
Well, I think it could be taken that way, but I think we're at a less risky position than we might have been 10 or 15 years ago, simply because there's so much new empirical information that backs up that point of view, coming from a variety of countries and a variety of different types of studies. So I think we've always had some speculation going, obviously, way back in our social and political history about how much of our differences were natural and how much were simply environmental or intellectual. But I think we have a fairly good set of research now to suggest that there's room at the table for part of our political orientation to be rooted in biology.
The problem that I have, and you may well address it, and forgive me for not having fully read it, but it's obviously not possible for a talk show host who has authors on regularly. So I tell that to authors so that they understand. So, but in that sense, I'm where the audience is, and we're learning about the book through the author. So one challenge would seem to me to be that we have to agree with you on what is liberal and conservative. For example, what would you call Stalin?
I think I would say I agree that one of the main issues is that we often have very time-bound notions of what might be liberal or conservative, or individuals. I think libertarians are a good example. In many ways, libertarians seem quite liberal, in other ways quite conservative. And we're not trying to address the sort of narrower, more particularistic individual examples, but really trying to get at a kind of continuum from left to right on particular types of issues that most people would recognize. So I think you can have individuals and you can have political systems that begin at one place and end at another, and that are difficult to classify simply. But I think the important thing to recognize is the reverse of that as many odd or difficult to categorize examples as we may have, I think we have a sense that in politics, as in art, as in views about the proper arrangement of a family, that sort of throughout history and across places we recognize a kind of a conservatism or being slightly more to the right in something like Sparta, and slightly more to the left in something like Athens, and even in your example of Stalin, it's hard not to see that whatever Stalin might have been, he probably was not as far to the left as Trotsky, for instance. So I think it's not that this is that we're providing a hard classification for right and left.
Right. So then, that's fine. I'll take that. Soviet studies was my field, and I'll say that in theory. Trotsky was to the left of Stalin, but it didn't matter because Trotsky supported the killing of opponents as much as Stalin did. He just may not have done it as much had he been in power, but we'll never know that. But so then, all right, then is Trotsky, if you will, at the end of your liberal spectrum?
Well, of course, we don't have access in our lab to Trotsky and Stalin, although that would be I'd admit, a fascinating study. But I think the more general idea is that we're in dealing with the general public. I think that we're...
Okay. All right, so we'll deal with the general American public when we come back after the break, and you'll tell us what your research has found. I have on a professor of political science at Rice, John Alford. He is the co-author with two other professors of Predisposed, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. I'm Dennis Prager. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Dennis Prager. I have a professor of political science at Rice University, John Alford. He is one of three professors who have co-authored this book, Predisposed. The subtitle is Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. And they try to find the differences among people within biology as well as within nurture. I take it that you grant that there is a nurture element, or do you believe it's entirely biological?
Oh, it's definitely, I think, more than just a combination of nature and nurture, which kind of everyone recognizes these days. I think there also is a substantial role for free will. So we're not trying to reduce political differences to biology, but we're also not happy with political differences being reduced to simply free will or simply nurture. I often think of, as a parent, I often think of parents and the experience of raising children. And one of the things that often happens to liberal parents or conservative parents is that they raise a family and there's a black sheep of the family. And so if you're a conservative couple and one of your children ends up as an adult being a liberal, you sometimes have to ask yourself, where did we go wrong? And I think this can be a good answer to that question, which is that clearly the child was raised, as were your other children, in an environment that was conservative, in which you taught them important things about the values you cherish. And they may have even grown up in a time in which it seemed obvious, something like the threat of 9/11, that it seemed obvious that there were real importances to traditional values. But nonetheless, there it is, one of your children, and you think, how did we fail this particular child? Is it because they were the youngest child and we spoiled them, or should we never have sent them off to the University of California? What happened to that child? And I think one of the answers is that nurture is important and free will is important, but that your children are also biological creatures, and just as one of your children may be outgoing and the other a little more introverted.
All right, so let's take the probably the best known, or certainly one of the best known differences between liberal and conservative. So a conservative believes that the human fetus has value, and the liberal does not believe that. How is that comport with the brain?
Well, I think I'm not sure that the best way to examine this is to take a particular issue at a moment in time and talk about where you end up on that specific issue. But I think if you take an issue and think about why at any particular time people might be on different ends of that issue, I think you certainly see things that emerge there that allow that position to be placed with other kinds of issues. So certainly the notion that individuals ought to sort of the actions have consequences and that personal responsibility is very important, I think figures into that, in addition to notions about sanctity of life. And I think those are important parts of what creates the cultural debate over exactly how to treat that. I think it's probably driven less by the sort of relative degree of maybe emotional concern for individuals than it is about issues that are more deeply rooted in things like personal responsibility.
So the people who believe in personal responsibility would be the ones who believe in which? It seems to me that if you believe in personal responsibility, you could fall on either side of the abortion debate.
Well, I think that if you think about something like criminal behavior, for example, the tendency to be, if we think about what the historical liberal side has been, it's a tendency to think of criminal behavior as being environmentally produced and therefore not really an individual's fault. And
all right, that would be the liberal position.
Right. So a liberal position might say, well, we need to basically reform this individual, provide them with something good to do and a better lifestyle and everything we find. And a conservative position is much more likely to say this is a personal choice, right? It's an act of
right.
free
That's
will,
fair.
and
Okay.
we should be more retributive.
And you have found brain differences between those who have. I assume that would hold true for capital punishment as well. Is that fair? Is that in your book?
It would hold true for something like capital punishment, and I think it's a nice example of how things can change over time. So if you think about the liberal position on capital punishment a few hundred years ago in Britain, for example, might have been that you don't use capital punishment for, say, minor theft if the person involved is under 12. So it's hardly something we recognize today as a liberal position, but the relative position, right? So in that kind of situation, someone with a conservative bent would favor whatever the currently cultural definition of a more retributive approach would be, and a person with a more liberal bent would favor what might in the perspective of history seem like a very draconian punishment, but at the time was a relatively less retributive.
Right, and you have found brains are different?
Well, I think one of the nicest examples of the sort of physiological finding is dealing with perception of threat. So conservatives are physiologically respond much more quickly and much more dramatically to threat, even if the threat is something as abstract as a burst of white noise, a startle. The startle response of conservatives is much stronger. Conservatives are much more responsive to and attentive to threatening pictures, for example, than liberals. Liberals really don't physiologically respond much differently to the picture of a snake than they do to the picture of a rabbit, whereas conservatives both attend quickly to the picture of the snake and respond much more viscerally to it. So I think about that as just one of many physiological differences that might underlie conservatism.
Yeah, the problem, no, I don't deny one moment the research on the snake-rabbit difference, and I find it actually intriguing that somebody would have an identical reaction to a rabbit as to a snake.
It does fit with a kind of stereotype that conservatives have of liberals.
Well, it does.
They just don't get it.
Yes, that's right. They don't know who snakes are. They think snakes are rabbits. I buy it, frankly. That's right.
It's Obama saying we're going to Cuba, right? We're going to Cuba because we don't know that Castro is an enemy, right? And so maybe it takes liberals a few minutes to work that out.
That's fascinating. We'll be back in a moment. Final segment coming up. You're listening to the Dennis Prager Show, final segment. And I want to make this clear to my listeners as well as to the professor, but especially to my listeners. The professor and I may differ in certain cases on what characteristics are liberal or conservative, but I don't deny that the way the brain is formed may be one of a constellation of factors in why people think a certain way. I have said often, Professor, and I suspect you being a professor have the opposite view of me on this, but I have said often, I think there is an unbridgeable gulf on the capital punishment issue. Every fiber in my body thinks that it's a cosmic injustice to allow all murderers to live out their lives, and others believe that it's a cosmic injustice to take any murderer's life, no matter how heinous, torturous the crime and how many people were murdered. And no talking matters. It's truly as if we do think differently.
I think you're exactly right, and I think you hit on a very important example of something that I believe is the most useful outcome of reading a book like ours that tries to look at this in an impartial way, where we're not trying to beat up on conservatives or liberals, but we're also importantly not trying to suggest, as I think too many people do, that in the right environment or with the right appeal, liberals and conservatives could come to see the world in the same way. I think that's a mistake. I think you're absolutely right that people who are deeply liberal and deeply conservative, people who feel it in their, possibly even in their DNA, see the world differently, feel the world in viscerally different ways, and think very differently about the world. And you're not going to bridge that. The best you can hope for is some acceptance that the other person's view is not one you will ever accept, but a recognition that it doesn't come simply from their ignorance or their foolishness or bad parenting, but maybe comes from the fact that they are just wired up differently than you, just as left-handed and right-handed people are wired up differently. But we're once thought to be just left-handers are once thought to just be stubborn people who refuse.
Is that why
to
you
accept
wrote the book, in order to have each side accept that of the other?
Absolutely, to accept both that that others are different, and also to accept that we won't change that. So we need to stop thinking we'll all come together in the middle.
Well, that's why the motto of my show is I prefer clarity to agreement. Let's understand where we differ.
I think we have here maybe a moment of both clarity and agreement.
Well, that's very nice. Sir, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure as well.
Thank you, sir. Professor John Alford, professor at Rice University. The book is Predisposed. I'm Dennis Prager. Male-female hour coming up.